In 536 AD, people woke up one morning and the sun never came back. Not for a day, not for a week, for 18 months, the sky turned the color of a dying fire, pale dim, wrong. Summer arrived and the temperature kept dropping. Crops that should have grown didn't. Animals that should have migrated didn't. And people from Ireland to China looked up at the sky and asked the same terrifying question. Is this the end of the world? What followed wasn't just a natural disaster. It was the slow, silent collapse of the entire human civilization as it existed. Empires fell, plagues ignited, tens of millions of people vanished from history. But here's what nobody tells you about 536 AD. The volcanic winter wasn't the most terrifying part of this story. What came after it was. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. You walk outside, the sun is there. Technically, you can see it, a pale, ghostly disk hanging in a sky that looks like someone drained all the color out of it. It's summer. It should be warm, but it's cold. Not slightly cold, wrong cold. The kind of cold that settles into your bones and makes you feel, somewhere deep in your gut, that something has broken in the natural order of things. Now, imagine that feeling lasting for 18 months. That was 536 AD. And nobody, not the farmers, not the philosophers, not the emperors sitting on their thrones, had any explanation for what was happening. The Byzantine historian Procopius, one of the sharpest minds of his era, wrote about it in language that still feels unsettling to read today. He described the sun giving out its light without brightness. He said it resembled an eclipse that never ended. He wrote that everyone assumed something terrible was coming. He had no idea how right he was across the known world. Simultaneously, without warning, a mysterious dry fog had settled over the sky. Not clouds, not rain, a veil. Thin enough to see through, thick enough to block out a significant portion of the sun's heat and light. In Europe, summer temperatures dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much to you, but in the 6th century, when every single person on Earth depended on what they could grow from the ground, 2.5 degrees was the difference between survival and starvation. In China, official records from the time describe snow falling in August. In Peru, ice cores from the Andes show a sudden, violent climate disruption. In Ireland, ancient tree ring data, nature's own diary, shows that trees essentially stopped growing during this period. Just stopped, as if the world had paused. And the question that haunted everyone who lived through it, and that scientists would spend centuries trying to answer, was simply, why? For a long time, historians suspected a volcanic eruption. The scale of the disruption pointed to something catastrophic in the atmosphere. Particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, ash, the kind of material that only one thing on Earth can inject directly into. The stratosphere in sufficient quantities, a volcano. But which one? And where? This is where the story gets strange, because for decades, scientists couldn't find a match. The leading candidates, various eruptions in the historical record, didn't quite fit the timeline. The fingerprint in the ice cores, the chemical signature in ancient glaciers from Greenland to Antarctica, pointed to something massive, something almost unprecedented in the last 2,000 years of human history. And then, in 2018, a team of researchers finally cracked it. Using ultra-precise sulfur isotope analysis on ice cores, essentially reading the chemical diary of the atmosphere layer by layer, they identified not one volcanic eruption, but three. Three massive eruptions between 536 and 545 AD, back to back. Like the Earth itself was having a breakdown. The first and most catastrophic is now believed to have originated from Iceland. A volcano so powerful that it blasted debris not just into the lower atmosphere, but into the stratosphere itself, where winds carried it around the entire planet within weeks. Like a gray blanket pulled over the Earth from pole to pole. But here's the twist that makes this story so much darker. The volcanic winter of 536 AD didn't arrive alone. It brought something with it. Something invisible. Something patient. Something that wouldn't reveal itself until the darkness had already done its worst work. Weakening populations, destroying food supplies, pushing entire societies to the edge of what they could endure. And what they couldn't endure was what was coming next. By 539-54 AD, the initial fog had begun to thin. The second eruption hit, then the third. By the time the volcanic winter finally released its grip on the world, sometime in the mid-5040s, humanity wasn't just cold and hungry, it was broken. Immune systems weakened by years of malnutrition, trade networks disrupted, grain stores empty, populations compressed into cities because the countryside could no longer sustain them. And in that moment of maximum vulnerability, pressed together, starving, immune systems compromised, the conditions were perfect. Perfect for something that would kill far more people than the darkness ever did. The Plague of Justinian was coming, and the volcanic winter had spent a decade building it the perfect world to destroy. There's a version of history where 536 AD is a footnote, a bad decade, a rough patch, something humanity weathers and moves past, the way it always does. That version of history didn't happen. What actually happened is that the volcanic winter didn't just damage civilization, it stress-tested it, every system, every empire, every food chain, every trade route, every social contract between rulers and the people they governed, and almost all of them failed. Let's start with the largest, most powerful empire in the Western world at the time. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, the most sophisticated political entity on Earth, was, by 536 AD, at the height of its ambition. Emperor Justinian had spent years reconquering lost Roman territory. His armies had swept through North Africa. They were pushing into Italy. The dream of a restored Roman Empire seemed, for the first time in a century, genuinely possible. Then the sky went dark. The grain harvests failed, not once, consecutively. Year after year of cold summers and failed crops created a famine that spread across the Mediterranean world like a slow fire. The Byzantine state, stretched thin by military campaigns and already straining under the cost of Justinian's ambitions, began to buckle. But famine, as terrible as it was, wasn't the killing blow. The killing blow was already on its way, and it was traveling along the same trade routes that had made the Byzantine Empire great. In 541 AD, 5 years into the volcanic winter, a ship arrived at the port of Pelusium in Egypt. Nobody paid much attention to it at first. Ships arrived at Pelusium all the time. It was one of the busiest ports in the Mediterranean world, a crossroads of trade between Europe, Asia, and Africa. But this ship was carrying something that would change the trajectory of human history: Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. The Plague of Justinian, named after the emperor who would nearly die from it himself, exploded out of Egypt and tore through the Byzantine Empire with a ferocity that left contemporaries struggling to find language adequate to describe it. At its peak in Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, the historian Procopius, the same man who had written about the darkened sun 5 years earlier, reported that 10,000 people were dying every single day. 10,000 per day in a single city. Now here's the part that historians spent a long time debating, and that changes everything about how we understand this period. Did the volcanic winter cause the plague? The answer is not directly. The plague bacterium existed before 536 AD. It would have found its way into human populations eventually, with or without the volcanic winter. But the volcanic winter did something arguably more sinister than cause it. It optimized it. Years of famine had weakened immune systems across entire populations. Desperate, starving people had flooded into cities, exactly the dense, unsanitary conditions where a flea-borne pathogen thrives. Trade networks, disrupted by political instability, had created unpredictable movement patterns that spread infection into populations with zero prior exposure and zero resistance. The volcanic winter didn't light the match. It spent a decade soaking the world in fuel, and the plague was the spark. What happened next was not just a public health catastrophe. It was a civilizational reckoning. The Byzantine Empire lost, depending on which estimates you accept, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people over the following 2 centuries of recurring plague outbreaks. The dream of a restored Roman Empire died in those years. But it wasn't just Byzantium. Across the world, the same pattern was playing out in different forms. In China, the volcanic winter contributed to the collapse of the Eastern Wei and Western Wei dynasties. Political instability, famine, and plague combined into a perfect storm that ended eras and began new ones. Millions died, borders dissolved. Entire ethnic and cultural groups that had dominated Chinese history for generations simply ceased to matter. In Mesoamerica, the ancient city of Teotihuacan, one of the largest cities on Earth at the time, a metropolis of pyramids and plazas that had dominated central Mexican culture for centuries, went into a steep decline during this period. Scholars debate the precise causes, but the climate disruption of the mid-6th century shows up clearly in the archaeological record, right at the moment this great city begins its irreversible unraveling. In the Arabian Peninsula, prolonged drought and agricultural collapse was destabilizing the traditional tribal and political order, creating a power vacuum, a spiritual hunger, and a restless population searching for new meaning. We'll come back to that, because what emerged from that particular moment of collapse would reshape half the world. But first, the societies that survived the volcanic winter, the plague, and the cascading collapse of the 6th century. Because they all had one thing in common. And when you understand what it was, you'll understand why the darkest century in human history was also, somehow, the most important. Here is the uncomfortable truth about catastrophe. It doesn't just destroy, it selects. When a crisis is severe enough, when it strips away every advantage, every inherited structure, every assumption about how the world is supposed to work, what remains isn't just survivors. What remains are adapters. The civilizations, the communities, the individuals who made it through the volcanic winter and the plague centuries weren't simply lucky. They shared something. A quality that sounds almost too simple to be the answer to such a monumental question. They were flexible, not militarily strong, not geographically isolated, not wealthy, flexible. The societies that survived 536 AD and its aftermath were the ones that could reorganize quickly, that could shift from wheat to hardier crops when the climate demanded it, that had decentralized enough power structures that when the center collapsed, the edges could still function, that had cultural or spiritual frameworks capable of absorbing catastrophic loss without total social disintegration. The rigid ones, the grand empires, the centralized bureaucracies, the civilizations built on the assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday, cracked under the pressure. And from those cracks, something entirely new grew. Let's talk about what the darkness actually built, because this is the part of the 536 AD story that almost nobody tells. Medieval Europe, the world of castles, feudal lords, local agriculture, and decentralized political power, was not a step backward from Rome. It was an adaptation to the collapse of a system that could no longer sustain itself. The feudal model, for all its cruelties, was in many ways a direct evolutionary response to the lesson of the 6th century. Don't put all your civilization in one basket. Distribute power, build local resilience, create systems that can survive the center failing. It's not the world Rome had imagined, but it's the world that could survive what Rome couldn't. And then there's Islam. In the 6110s AD, roughly 70 years after the volcanic winter began, in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula that had been so profoundly destabilized by the cascading effects of the 6th century, collapse. The Prophet Muhammad began receiving revelations that would become the Quran. The timing is not coincidence, it's context. The volcanic winter and its aftermath had shattered the existing political and social order across the Near East and Arabia. The Byzantine and Sassanid Persian empires, the two great superpowers of the region, had exhausted themselves in decades of brutal war, partly fueled by the resource pressures of the climate. Catastrophe. Both were hollowed out, weakened, operating on the fumes of former greatness. Into that vacuum, spiritual, political, social, Islam emerged with extraordinary force. Within a century of Muhammad's death, the Islamic world stretched from Spain to Central Asia. It absorbed the remnants of collapsed empires. It preserved and transmitted the knowledge of the ancient world through its libraries and scholars. It built a civilization that at its peak was the most sophisticated on Earth. None of that trajectory is imaginable without the collapse that preceded it. The volcanic winter of 536 AD didn't just end the ancient world, it built the medieval one. But the most unsettling part of this story isn't historical. It's the part the scientists found in the ice. Those ice cores that allowed researchers to finally identify the volcanic culprit behind 536 AD. They contain something else. Something the scientists who study them describe with a particular kind of careful, measured language that, if you know how to read it, sounds a lot like alarm. The atmospheric fingerprint of 536 AD, the sulfur signature, the particulate layers, the sudden, dramatic disruption in the chemical record is not unique in the geological timeline. It has happened before. Multiple times. In deep prehistory, Eruptions of comparable or even greater scale reshaped the Earth's climate and, almost certainly, the course of human history in ways we can barely trace. And the volcanoes that produce these events, they're still there. Campi Flegrei in Italy, a supervolcano that sits beneath one of the most densely populated regions in Europe, has been showing signs of unrest for decades. Scientists monitor it constantly. It last erupted in 1538. Before that, its major eruptions helped drive Neanderthal populations to extinction. The Yellowstone supervolcano. The Toba caldera in Indonesia, whose eruption approximately 74,000 years ago is theorized to have reduced the entire human population to perhaps 10,000 individuals. These are not hypothetical threats. They are geological realities on geological timescales. And here's what the ice cores tell us about warning time. When Iceland's volcano triggered the catastrophe of 536 AD, the eruption that darkened the sky of the entire planet, the time between the initial eruption and the global atmospheric effect? Weeks. Not years, not months, weeks. The people of 536 AD had no warning, no science to explain what was happening, no global communication to coordinate a response. No stored food supplies designed to survive multi-year agricultural collapse. No political systems built for that level of sustained, simultaneous, global crisis. We have the science. We have the communication. We have, in theory, the ability to prepare in ways they never could. But do we have the will? The people of 536 AD looked up at a sky that had stopped working, and they did the only thing they could do. They endured. They lost empires. They lost millions of lives. They lost entire ways of organizing the world that had taken centuries to build, and from the ruins, slowly, painfully, they built something new, something that became eventually us. The question that the volcanic winter of 536 AD leaves us with isn't really historical. It's deeply, uncomfortably personal. If the sky went dark tomorrow, what would we leave behind? What do you think would collapse first if something like 536 AD happened today? The food supply, the power grid, or something else entirely? Drop your answer below. Some of the responses on videos like this are genuinely more unsettling than the history itself. And if you want to go deeper, there's another story connected to this one. A civilization that saw the collapse coming and made a choice that still divides historians today. That one's worth your time.